Hey everybody, hope this video finds you well. So chapter 9, the Islamic world. So we're going to start this off with the origination of the Islamic faith in the Arabian Peninsula. We'll look at the city of Mecca, a very cosmopolitan city due to its already being a religious center, housing the religious artifact, the Kaaba, which we will talk about later. What else we'll talk about in this chapter? We're going to look at Islam. We'll look at the spread of Islam across Asia. We'll also look at some breakaway territories from the Islamic world. And it looks like that's mostly look at some trade and commerce. So this is primarily Islam over an 800-year period here, from the birth of it all the way through medieval ages. So the origins of Islam. We look at Arabian social and economic structure. So who were the Arabs? Who were the Arabs that were the where Islam is founded? The Muslim world we'll eventually call it. Well, primarily they began, and they had been for thousands of years, Bedouins, which were in essence sort of this image here, this picture you see. They were nomadic peoples, merchants, raiders. They would raid and steal. They would attack the trade caravans going across the Silk Roads. They were very nomadic. They moved around a lot. They were also pastoralists, meaning they they herded animals, camels, goats, sheep, things like that. And they were also incredibly militaristic, due to the nature of constant competition for very limited resources, and raiding of different caravan lines. They were very militaristic. They were aggressors among themselves and against all the other surrounding empires. These were not empire building peoples, and yet they were surrounded by empires: Roman Empire, the Persian empires, Indian empires. So it's interesting. Let's see what else we want to talk about here. The Arabian society primarily consists of these Bedouin tribes. Most of the tribes were associated around kinship groups. They were kin and family related, often led by a senior family member, things like this. A particular tribe might have both nomadic and sedentary elements. So you'd have part of the tribe which would roam around looking for resources or opportunities, caravans, and then there might be specific villages or towns where they had actually settled down and done some limited farming, or had like permanent herds of animals that would roam the local hillsides, things like this. They often would trade or steal for items they needed, whether it be milk or animal skins, things like that. They might trade for weapons or cloth, for instance. Sometimes they served as caravan guards. So because they knew the caravan route so well and they were already relatively militaristic, they might actually guard some caravans for a price. And also desert guides. Long stretches of the desert were indecipherable to many outsiders. Many oases or market towns develop that would often become centers of local communities. And these market towns would often generate revenue through trade, like hotel room sale, rentals, food, stuff like this. And these market towns also usually contain some type of religious shrine. That was one of the reasons that they would develop, is they would become a tourist center for people to come to pray to a religious shrine. And bear in mind, before the coming of Islam, most Bedouin peoples were polytheistic pagan. They believed in multitudes of different gods and spirits and nature spirits, and spirituality was rampant, but there was no uniform spirituality. There were many different gods. Your typical paganistic, polytheistic society, as just about all societies were before Christianity. Well, even after Christianity, most societies were still this way. So shrines were often considered neutral places, places where you would not fight or attack or challenge each other, because this was common with the limited resources available in the Arabian Peninsula. You often had to fight to survive. And the towns were considered neutral places where you weren't supposed to do that. In comes Muhammad. Muhammad was orphaned at a very young age. Eventually, he is taken in and raised by an uncle who's a merchant and a leader in Mecca, in the town of Mecca. Um, and he raises up, and he's just raised in this merchant family, which was a wealthy family in this market town of Mecca. He comes involved in trade. Eventually, he marries a rich widow, Khadijah, and as the tradition was, he inherited her wealth. So he was already comfortable, but now he became wealthy, and with lots of money and resources available to him, became financially secure. Once he reaches like age 40 or something, he starts devoting his whole life to religious contemplation and religious study, and he starts going around the mountains of around Mecca, and even to the point of starting to meditate in caves alone. Now, while praying in one of these caves, in one of these times, he is visited with revelations of God. He claims he is visited by the angel Gabriel, who is a messenger of God. He gives him all kinds of commandments and ideas and information. And he commands Muhammad to preach all this to the masses, to preach. In essence, Gabriel will communicate messages from God, and then Muhammad will communicate those messages of God to the people. During his life, very little was written down. Most of everything about Muhammad during his lifetime was simply passed orally, which was the standard tradition in this area, this region, was to pass on history and information orally. Also very common in this time period. He lives from 570 to 632, passes around 632, and we're going to talk more about that. Years later, most of the things written down that are his revelations, his words of God, are written down in the Quran. The original Quran, the first writings of the Quran date to around 651, and this becomes the sacred book of Islam, which is interpreted as the actual words of God that are then being disseminated to man, to the followers, to the true believers. Also in Arabic. It was written in Arabic, of course, and it was actually forbidden to translate it to another language. Although it has, of course, happened, and you can find English versions of it on the internet, or books, I have no idea. But you can find translations of it, even though it's technically forbidden to translate it out of Arabic. After his death, there was a lot of controversy about his teachings. In essence, lots of dispute about what was true, what was not true, and specifically who should be the leader, who should actually be the leaders of Islam after Muhammad's death. We will discuss that as well. What was often agreed upon was that Muhammad's life should serve as an example for all people, for all Muslims to follow. And a lot of this is revealed in what was called the Hadith, which is a collection of different sayings or different stories about Muhammad, a collection of stories about his life. In essence, sort of a moral guide for all people to follow and to try to live up to this, how Muhammad lived his life, his sort of idealized as a perfect life of a Muslim. This became also a legal basis for the way of life, a legal basis for how many laws were structured around. If Muhammad did it, then it's okay. If Muhammad didn't do it, it's not okay. That's a simplistic way of looking at it, but still, a lot of the laws are generally structured about how he lived his life. And Muhammad is seen as a perfect example, in essence, the way he lived and prayed. A lot of this was seen as what we would call the normative example. The normative example is the Sunnah. It is the normative example. The hadith are the stories and the anecdotes about his life, but this idea of what it is to be the perfect life or have the perfect life of a Muslim is we would call the Sunnah for the believers, how each person should be or how each person should live their life. So the one is the stories, and the other is the name for what we call the idea of living the perfect life, how each person should be a good Muslim believer and follower. Gives you an idea here. We have Saudi Arabia, we have Mecca here. We're going to be talking about Medina as well. Um, Very limited resources here. Much of this is simply desert. Even in this time period, today it's even worse. Today it's gotten worse over the centuries. But back then, even then, it was a large amount of desert. And this is one of the reasons the Bedouins were the way they were. So aggressive, warrior-like, nomadic, constantly moving around, and lots of competition, very limited resources to survive upon. So you had to fight to survive, which was not uncommon in this part of the world. Here in Africa, there was very limited resources. You go up to Central Asia, where the Mongols we'll talk about, where they developed also incredibly limited resources. Very dry, mostly mountainous, rocks and dirt. And we find these peoples have to become very warrior like and very aggressive just to provide for their families. And this has great implications on world history. The tenets of Islam. Islam is monotheistic. It is our third monotheistic belief, our third world religion. Monotheistic with one God known as Allah. And the faith, pretty much the whole faith rests on the power and the oneness of Allah. The power and the oneness of the God Allah. As I'll get to in a minute, this is the same God as the Christian God. In the Muslim belief, this is the same God as the Christian God, as the Jewish God. It's all the same God. The difference is, and they also recognize the other prophets. They recognize Jesus. They recognize Abraham. They just believe that Muhammad is the one true prophet. In essence, Jesus and Abraham got it wrong. They got some aspects right, but they made some mistakes. They didn't get it quite right. Muhammad is the last one true prophet of God who got it right. That's how it is seen. So they do again have similar patriarchs: Abraham, Moses, Jesus, lots of beliefs, and similar leaders of the church, all seen as influential figures, all mentioned in the religious writings of Islam, even seen as prophets of God. But simply that this same God, the final prophet's Muhammad, the true prophet, and that all the earlier teachings of Christians and Hebrews were misdirected or misguided. Not 100% wrong, but just they didn't interpret the words of God properly. And Muhammad did. The five pillars of Islam is the Quran. At its heart, the Quran is a book of rules and laws, really, at its heart. It's almost like, think of the Ten Commandments, only expand the Ten Commandments to an entire scripture, an entire book of religious writings. It wasn't just 10 rules, it's thousands of rules and laws and policies, and how it is all the rules of the faith, really. The moral code is very important, detailed in the Quran. It's often based upon what we call the five pillars of Islam, five aspects of Islam that sort of the faith is based around. The profession of faith, of course, is first. There is just one God, Allah, profession of faith. Further, that you must pray 5 times a day, pray regularly. You fast during the holy month of Ramadan. You fast, and I'm not positive on this, but I believe, because I'm certainly not an expert in Islam, I believe it's just during the day. You fast during the day, I believe that what it is. During that 1 month a year, of course, you're always to make at some point in your lifetime, you're to make a pilgrimage, the Hajj. This is a sort of representative of the trip that Muhammad made between Mecca and Medina when he was, I believe, coming back after he's kicked out of Mecca. He goes to Medina and comes back. We'll talk about that. And I think this is supposed to be representative of that. And of course, charity to the poor. And this is probably representative of the fact that pretty much all the followers of Muhammad early on were poor, regular, common people, poor in the town, poor Bedouins. And but that's common. Christianity the same way. Pretty much all the followers of Christianity early on were simply poor people, lots of slaves. So in Islam, it's similar too. It was very popular among the poor, which that's often the way it is with these religious beliefs. Buddhism was the same way. Buddhism was common among the poor and the common because they are the worst treated in society. They're the ones that have everything to lose. They're I guess I say it the other way around. They have nothing to lose because they don't have anything. They're exploited, they're oppressed, and they're looking for an answer. They're looking for a profit. And so it's not surprising that among these people, they find someone who they could look up to who will give them hope, whether it be Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad. They find some salvation or some hope and promise and this figure giving them all these words of power and words of a better future, for instance. And so usually this is where we find our followers. And we think this is a big part of this. This charity is supposed to be towards the poor and the common people. Um, in the Hajj, I don't think got totally specific on that. The way that translates in the modern world today is everyone is to, at the time, you're supposed to every year make a trip to Mecca to see the holy sites there, to see the Kaaba. Through your life, you were supposed to do it every single year. That was when everybody lived in close proximity. Today, from what I understand, the accepted measure is once in your lifetime, at least once in your lifetime, because of course Islam is global, so most people don't have the means to travel across the world necessarily. So once in your lifetime, you should at least travel to Mecca, if possible. That is an expectation. That is what I understand today. Obviously, you should do it every year if you could, but most people don't have the resources to do that, especially if you live on the other side of the world. A couple of laws that are very interesting or specific. They forbid alcoholic beverages. They forbid gambling. Any association with pork is forbidden. Shellfish is forbidden. Usury is also forbidden. You're not allowed to charge interest, although we do find Muslims find a way around this. Jews, same way. Jews were actually forbidden to do usury. They find ways around it as well. Um, uh, it's money lending, really. Usury really has to do with money lending and charging interest. And as you know, if you don't lend money if you're not going to make something off of it. That's the reason you do it. So people find ways around this to somehow, I know some people will charge like a fee. It's not interest. It's just a fee for my loaning you money. Yeah, red tape kind of stuff, religious red tape. It's a way of getting around the religion. So we see this in different religious beliefs. Nothing special about Islam. We see in other places as well. Um, let's see what else we want to talk about here. Islam spread beyond Arabia. Islam is the fastest spreading religion in world history. In a century, it covers an area, about 150 years, it covers an area like 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. There's nothing it's even begin to compare it. It spreads 100 times faster than Christianity. It's just crazy how quickly it spreads. In Mecca, Muhammad had a big following of believers among the poor. This is really started in Mecca. Lots of followers among the poor. He was challenged by upper class townspeople, fearing he was going to start an uprising. Um, he flees to Medina. This fleeing to Medina is known as the Hijrah. This escape from Mecca. This is a sketch here of Mecca with the Kaaba, this symbolic rock, this symbolic stone inside, um, which I don't believe anyone's allowed to see anymore. I think you can only go outside the building and touch the outside of the building, as demonstrated in the other image you saw back here. In this picture, you see the people actually walking around. There's thousands of people walking around the Kaaba here. It's inside this building. I believe there's only the priests, only the Islamic priests are allowed inside. Only special priests are allowed to actually be inside the building. But every year people do travel who can, and they simply walk around in circles, and they move the crowds until you slowly get closer and closer to the middle, and you can actually touch the building, and then you have to slowly out. You have to move back out again. It's a very complicated process. Also, people can walk around and touch the building where the Kaaba is, which is the center of the holy faith. Um, Here, let's get back to this. So, this event is the Hijrah, where he had to actually flee Medina. They threatened his life. They thought he was he was challenging the authority of the leadership of Medina. So they in essence kick him out. This starts a conflict between Medina and Mecca. Hopefully, I was saying Mecca. I apologize if I said it wrong. Mecca is where he has to flee and run from Mecca. And it starts this fight between he flees to Medina. And it starts this fight between Mecca and Medina, which lasts for years. Finally, in the mid 620s, this happens around 620-ish or so, something like that. In the 620s, Muhammad comes back to Mecca with an army and actually conquers Mecca and makes it part of his beginnings of his empire. Um, and finally, he conquers this entire central region of the Arabian Peninsula, the areas around Mecca, Medina, conquers it all with an army. He combines multiple Bedouin tribes to work together and work towards a common cause under this one single belief system of Islam. And he does unify many tribes in Central Arabia before his death in 32. And this unification of these tribes under this one faith continues and grows and expands quickly after his death. Traditionally, all the association of Bedouin tribes was generally competitive externally, and internally simply associated with family and kinship. So really, your relations with others was often a competitive basis, and your relations with internally was your family. Well, under Muhammad, we get a new relationship, a brand new creation called the Ummah. In essence, this is a universal relationship among all people of the faith. Therefore, like today, the Ummah would include the entire world. It includes anywhere and everywhere where we have Muslim communities. They're all part of this tied together shared faith of this universal community, all under the this higher authority of Allah. So the idea, I think, was to stop the fighting and bring peace to the different groups and have them all work towards a common cause of expanding the Arab authority and Arab culture under this one unified faith, and it works quite well for quite a while. As mentioned, under the Byzantine chapter, it talked about the Sassanids, and yes, the Muslims often went after the Sassanids. They often went after the Byzantines themselves. Constant warfare had already existed between the Sassanids, which were the Persians, and the Byzantines, which were what were left of the Romans. So constant warfare had always existed. So all that happens is the Muslims simply take advantage of this, and you take two weakened empires, the Sassanids and the Byzantines, and the Muslims just start chipping away at them. The Arabian power simply expands and starts taking chunks of the Persian Empire, chunks of the Byzantine Empire, and of course other places due to their weakened status. Byzantine and Sassanids were constantly invaded and attacked. In 642, under the forces of Umar, in 642, the Islamic forces, in essence, bring down the entire Persian Empire. So the Arabian, this brand new upstart, not even existed 20 years earlier, new Arabian empire conquers the Persian Empire, which had stood for 4 centuries. This brand new empire out of nowhere overruns and conquers the entire massive Persian Empire, which had stood for 4 centuries, and conquers it in the 640s. Furthermore, they took large chunks of Byzantine territory. They took like half of the Byzantine Empire in Asia, Syria, Africa, took all that. This empire, this brand new Muslim empire, which is really what we should call it now as an empire, does things that no one else had ever been able to do, conquering parts of and completely conquering ancient empires which had stood for a very long period of time. They eventually expand all the way to the edge of China. They even take parts of Western India. It's amazing how quickly it moves and how quickly people convert. And we'll talk about sort of why that happens. Arab forces quickly spread across North Africa. They go all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar within just a few years. Strait of Gibraltar, that's the point that connects Africa to Spain. That little bitty point, which is basically the entry point into the Mediterranean Sea. And they get all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar within just a few years. They invade Spain. They advance into the Frankish kingdoms in Central Europe. And finally, they're stopped in 632 by Charles Martel. We talked about that in the last chapter. And has Charles Martel not stopped the Muslim incursions into Europe? They very well might have conquered Europe. It's possible that they might have conquered Europe, which would have been an incredible threat to Catholic Christianity. Might have even brought down Catholic Christianity. Certainly possible. Because they were coming up the other side too. They were invading and trying to conquer Byzantium. So very interesting how quickly it moved, how quickly it expanded. Again, within a century, it goes from a couple little towns to an area. Well, by 750, they conquer an area almost equivalent to 5 times the entire Roman Empire. I mean, look at this massive territory. Muhammad is Medina and Mecca right here, Central Arabian Peninsula. Within just the next 20 years, they conquer parts of Africa. They conquer all of the Persian Empire, all the way to India. Then the yellow and blue, they extend all this. I mean, this was Rome here. They take much of what had been the Roman Empire, and they take all of the Persian Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to India, all the way to the edge of China. There's just nothing ever been like this. It's pretty amazing, honestly. So the reasons for the spread of Islam. Jihad is one. Now, there's lots of interpretations of jihad. Some hold that it signifies an individual struggle against sin. That might be the most close interpretation for most Muslims. And your individual struggle against sin as you progress towards perfection. Others claim it's a holy war. It's a holy war against unbelievers to spread the faith. This is the most common Christian or European interpretation, that it's simply a holy war against Christians to conquer Christianity or to conquer any unbelievers. Different ways of looking at it. Most likely, it's a combination of both. On a personal level, it's your own personal war, your own personal struggle against sin to achieve a more clear connection and close connection to Allah and the faith. It's a combination of this religious fervor, this jihad. It's also a combination of the military might of the Muslims, which was unmatched in the time period. The military might, as well as the military weakness of the others. You have to consider that Persia and Byzantium were incredibly powerful, but in the face of the Muslims, they collapsed. Muslims certainly were willing to die for their faith, believing they would have a type of eternal salvation. So, well, also Byzantium and the Persians had beat each other up for centuries, making them very weak. So it left a lot of gaps for the Muslims to take advantage of, and they did. Captured cities as well, increased the great wealth. The more and more cities the Muslim world, the Arabs took, the more and more cities and wealth they captured. And some captured cities, such as when they captured Jerusalem, for instance, or Hebron, these were very important religious sites. Large populations of Jews and Christians in these cities. This as well helped Islam spread because it was able to capture these particular wealthy places, these important religious sites, which had lots of tourism, lots of travelers. When they captured Persia, Persia was a wealthy empire, and they emptied the treasuries of the Persian king, the Persian emperors. They were lots of money and wealth there as well, lots of power. Yeah, and as we're going to talk about, when they did conquer areas, they were generally very accepting of Jews and Christians in their territories. They had to pay a tax, but they generally let them stay and they didn't force them to convert. And yet we find in the Persian and Byzantine empires much more hard line towards any non-Christians. You had to be very specifically Christian, and they were very intolerant of anyone who wasn't. We find Muslims to actually be very tolerant of other religious faiths. All they required was for you to submit to their authority, and generally they let most people just go about living their lives like normal. They didn't require you or expect most people to convert, actually. They expected the upper class, the leadership, often to convert, simply for ease of trade, ease of political connections. But the masses often didn't do mass conversions, and the Muslims were often okay with that, if for no other reason than the tax. Non-Muslims had to pay a tax, which was actually a significant source of revenue for the Arabian Empire. Lots of economic benefits that came out of this with the spread of Islam as well, because the money often brought in by Islamic powers, because they had extensive trade connections, and they were having such a large area now, and they were controlling lots of the caravan and trade routes, which the Bedouins were very well experienced with, either raiding or being part of, also facilitates trade and wealth. And if the new bosses come in and they're going to say, well, we got to follow us, but we're also going to enrich you in the process, a lot of people are like, okay, sure, I'll call you boss as long as I become wealthy off of it, which was often the case for the ruling upper classes in most of these regions. And that's all you had to do. If you could control or convert the ruling top 5% or even 1%, you then controlled the region. The Caliphate. Here's where we actually start talking about the official name of the empire. The leaders of, after Muhammad, the leaders of the Bedouins and the leaders of the Arabs were often referred to as caliphs. And therefore, a caliph becomes caliphate. This is, in essence, the name of the empire, what they would call it. After Muhammad died, we have Abu Bakr, which was an important associate, elected as the first caliph. This becomes the political and religious leader of Islam. Another thing about Islam you should understand is while in the Western world we often try to separate church and state, the idea that church and state should be separate, although that is misleading because we really don't have separation of church and state, really, truthfully, in our society, even today. And certainly in early European society, separation of church and state, they were two separate entities, but they were more like they were intertwined. They were intertwined together. They were separate, but they crossed over, intertwined all the time. Islam doesn't do that. Islam doesn't gets away with all those pretenses and simply says religious and secular authority are pretty much the same. The leadership and power structure in the Arab society and the Muslim caliphate was the same. Political and religious went hand in hand. So they didn't try to act like it was separate. It's generally a political religious state is the way it was in this time period. Let's see what else we have going on. This was an event which really marks with Abu Bakr taking charge. It sort of marks the beginning of this idea of the universal Muslim community, the Ummah. This new caliphate was under Abu Bakr. His first three successors were Umar, Uthman, and Ali. These are the next successors, the next caliphs. Umar establishes the authority that the Bedouin tribes, their power is really based on conquest. The Bedouin tribes have to conquer and expand the territory. This becomes standard practice for this early empire. Uthman is next. Uthman seeks to protect the economic interests. Uthman is really more focused on power and wealth, not necessarily just expansion. Uthman, though, however, was from a Mecca family which actually resisted the Prophet, a Mecca family which questioned Muhammad's leadership. And another leader which arises in the same time period is Ali. So we have another caliph, Ali, arise. Well, Uthman and Ali don't get along. They both have different views of Muhammad's authority, and in essence, these are all warlord chieftains that come along right after Muhammad, and they all fight over who's going to be in charge, who has the real true authority to run the huge burgeoning empire, which is becoming very powerful and wealthy very quickly. Who's going to control all this? Who's going to control all the resources? Who's going to control the community? Who is going to be in charge of this massively growing empire? So we get Uthman and Ali going against each other. Uthman is assassinated by Ali's followers. Ali takes control, and then because they suspect that Ali had Uthman assassinated, Uthman's followers assassinate Ali. So Umar, for one single caliph, we actually had peace right directly after Muhammad. For a few years, Umar was in charge, and we do see this sort of expanding empire. And then as soon as Umar is gone, Uthman and Ali start fighting over it, and we see this split. So the split in the Muslim church happens really quick. And I say it that way because you look at the Catholic Christian church, you don't see the major split in the Catholic Christian church for centuries. In Islam, it happens almost immediately. You see this split, and Islam goes two different directions. And again, they both claim they're not legitimate. This entire period was only about 30 years. This whole period of Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali, all of this really lasts less than like 30 years. And it's really amazing how quickly the whole thing falls apart. And many scholars think the reason behind that, a big part of that is that there was so much immediate wealth and power generated that they were all scrambling to see who was going to control this. And they claim different families should have authority, and it really goes along two different family lines, is how it splits. With his assassination, another family comes into power, and this new family, which manages to actually hold on for what, over 100 years, is the Umayyad family. And the Umayyad family are the ones that really set the course for Islam, the majority of Islamic followers. So this new Umayyad family really splits the Ummah. The Ummah is the whole family, the whole society of all Muslims. It really splits the entire religious community. Ali's followers identify themselves as the Shia Ali or the Shia. They are the followers. They claim that they are the actual descendants. Why? Because Ali was an actual cousin of Muhammad. He was related by blood. Therefore, the belief is that he should have been the legitimate follower. His family should have been the legitimate follower. The other side of it, the Umayyads, they and they start calling themselves the Sunnis. They take the belief that they are the, put this way, blood descent doesn't matter. They believe that they are the proper military leaders. That the Quran is about religious faith, not about the man. In other words, Muhammad's important. Muhammad's a prophet. It doesn't take away the power of Muhammad, but that Muhammad is simply a placeholder for the real power of the faith. And the real power of the faith is through Allah and through the Quran, which is the actual words and teachings of God. Muhammad was simply the mouthpiece. So the followers of Ali, it will become the Shia, believe that the line of power and descent should come from Muhammad, regardless, even though the faith is there, but Muhammad was the actual prophet. Therefore, leadership of the Ummah should be from Muhammad, or the descendants of Muhammad, the descendants of Muhammad. While the Sunni believers say it isn't about Muhammad, it's really about the faith, and so they believe they are the actual leaders of the faith. And so the Shias really take to following imams. Imams are seen as, in essence, they are sort of community prayer leaders, and they're the only interpreters of the faith. These imams are the community prayer leaders and the actual interpreters of the Quran and the faith. The Sunnis, again, saying blood doesn't matter, it's simply about the religion itself. They often held that the Quran had to be interpreted, but they say the Quran has to be interpreted by religious scholars, like a whole group of scholars, known as the ulama. So the Shia put most of their faith and belief in an imam as a single religious leader that interprets the faith, versus the Sunni really focus on a whole cadre of religious scholars that form a religious community that all interpret it as a sort of as a group. Um, and they take two very different directions. And today, these are the two major splits in their religious faith, the Sunni and the Shia. And don't quote me on this, but I believe the Sunni are the majority. One is much larger than the other. The one of these directions is most of Muslims in the world, and the other is a much smaller group. I think the Sunni is the much bigger one, and the Shia is a much smaller one, I believe. So, the Abbasid Caliphate we'll look at, which takes place after the Umayyad. Umayyad Caliphate was the one really responsible for all the expansion. The expansion. Oh, by the way, in case you hear any noise in the background, I don't think it's. I went back and checked the video. It's really, you can't notice it much, but it's a little bit. I'm having some construction done, or what's construction, I guess, on the roof, some roofing done. So, you hear a little noise in the background. That's what it is. I don't think it's really should interfere with the video though. So the Abbasid Caliphate really follows the Umayyad. The Umayyad did most of the expansion, and then the Abbasid comes along afterwards. Abu al-Abbas overthrows the Umayyad dynasty. His successors moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, which is in modern-day Iraq. This became a crossroads for trade routes. It became a cosmopolitan intellectual center of science, medicine, astronomy, law, a population of about 1 million. This was the most advanced society on the globe, hands down. Really no really no debate. There was no society that had the same level of science, mathematics, learning, law, culture as this society. It was more advanced than anything going on in Europe or Asia, China, India. Certainly was. It had the money, it had the resources, it brought, it was a true center of the world. It was sort of what ancient Rome had been. It brought people from all across Afro-Eurasia into the Middle East for learning and scholarship and trade and opportunities. Again, a million population, one of the only ancient cities ever to reach this population. So, really interesting. It opens the empire to all kinds of outside influences, but of course expands Islam. One of the things that moves along trade routes is not just trade goods, but religion and culture and faith. So the more and more trade and connections that came through the Muslim world, came through Baghdad and came through the heart of the empire, also reverse translated into religious faith spread across the old world as well. Um, Initially, Islam had pretty much included mostly just the upper classes and the warriors. That was one of the reasons it spread so fast. But over time, especially with it becoming such a foundational building block of culture in the Middle East, it now becomes basically the faith of most conquered peoples. It simply becomes standard in many Middle Eastern areas simply to be Islamic. It just becomes easy. It's actually a really easy faith to convert to, and even the requirements of it are not that complicated. So it maybe not as quite as simple to convert to as Christianity, but Christianity didn't have a strong hold in this part of the world. There's Christians. There's Christians in Baghdad. There's Christians in this part of the world, but not as nearly as strong a hold um, as this. Rulers also were thought to be semi-divine. This was sort of a change in the Islamic faith. Rulers were believed to be, well, they were emperors. They ruled as emperors, semi-divine. You couldn't touch them. You couldn't get close to them. In many ways, they emulated the ancient Persian emperors. This is the same part of the world. In essence, they were the modern Persian emperors. You couldn't touch them. People had to taste their food. There was requirements you couldn't even breathe the same air as them, exactly like the Persian emperors. Only they're Muslim. Elaborate court rituals, imagery, very, very similar to the Persian Empire, of which this empire was really founded on top of. Much of the wealth and power and status that became the Arabian Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, was simply based upon the Persian foundations which had already existed. The Abbasids also turned many Turkish slaves after converting, and this would be in the region of Turkey, which is right outside of the Byzantine area. Turned a lot of those into soldiers, capitalized on their horsemanship, their military skills, and the reason I decide to note this is this becomes a common process and standard procedure for most Muslim armies over the next several centuries. From the 800s to probably the 1400s, this becomes standard practice to conquer a territory, take the people there, and then convert them over and make them into Muslim slave soldiers. And over time, those Muslim slave soldiers are simply adopted into the Muslim culture and simply become functioning members of society over a while. Uh, they do this from Europe all the way to Africa to Asia to India. And this is one of the things that helps them convert because these people are sort of initially they're slaves. They're forced to fight for the Muslims as slave soldiers. But over time, they eventually have families, they have kids, they're as was common practice back then, when you would conquer a territory, they'd usually give some of the treasure and wealth to the soldiers, which might include women, and they would get wives. And eventually, these slave soldiers are just incorporated into the Muslim culture as they convert over to Islam, and it simply become part of the Muslim community. Another way that Islam grows and expands by doing this. Administration of the empire, which was again, it became huge, became a massive empire. The Abbasid dynasty became a true empire from the caliph, who was now really an emperor, all the way down the line. As more and more territories came under Muslim authority, governors, or what they were often referred to as emir, which would be a local governor, they were appointed to maintain order. They were appointed to collect taxes. Often the officials from the local populations were allowed to remain in power, but only below the emir. Say this was Egypt, Syria, India. When they would conquer these territories, they would allow the upper classes, and again, this is one of the ways they conquered, they would convert them over, and then they would allow them to stay in power and status, continue to be wealthy and powerful as an elite group. But the emir actually outranked them because the emirs effectively they answered directly to the caliph, to the leader, to the emperor of the entire empire. This is sort of the way they're allowed to leave the local people in charge, as long as they were Muslim, and yet they had a connection of an actual superior governor who reported directly to Baghdad. Not uncommon. We see this in Europe. We see this in Byzantium. This actually becomes a standard practice in this time period to allow when the Byzantines conquer, when the Franks conquer, when the Muslims conquer, they would conquer the local population. They would allow the local elites to stay in power. That was how they were able to conquer so easily because the rich got to stay rich. They simply had a brand new king they were reporting to, but they're still rich and powerful, and they still have lots of servants or slaves. And then they would usually appoint one particular person who would be a direct appointee of the king or emperor that would actually oversee the whole region. Even if there was a local governor, that governor is who related to the people, who interacted with the people, who would then follow the local governor because he's a local person. But the governor would then, in turn, actually report to a particular official that would report directly to the emperor. Like in European, it was like the Missi Dominici. Here, it's the emir. This was a standard thing often in the time period. It's very interesting how it worked. In practice, the ulama, this whole group of religious scholars, not the caliph, are the ones who actually interpreted the sacred law. So the ulama, this was Sunni faith. The ulamas are the ones who actually interpreted the faith, and then they would then reveal it to the population. They interpreted the Quran. The ulama's interpretations eventually were compiled together over several centuries, and they put this all together in what's known as the Sharia. We refer to as a Sharia law, which is the interpretations of the Quran in practice. It would be like taking 1,000 laws and then having a group of scholars get together and interpret how those 1,000 laws would apply to all of society in every situation. How those 1,000 laws could be interpreted in every type of situation, every type of community, among every type of relationship, which would apply to hundreds of thousands of different situations. So you take a core of group of laws and you find a way to interpret it to every single thing that could possibly happen. And this ultimately becomes what we call the Sharia law, which is sort of the whole social, political, criminal law that should govern all Muslim society. This became the law of the land in the Abbasid Caliphate. It's interesting, and this is the Sharia law, which applies to all. All right. Then we'll move on here to what we call the fragmentation, and this is when the empire actually starts to come apart into pieces. I mean, it's a massive empire. It had to fall apart eventually. Even though the people are all still Muslim, the empire itself starts to come apart. So we'll start with these breakaway territories and the Shia gains. So during this period, the Abbasid Caliphate was under constant attack by other barbarians, the Mongols, for instance, the Huns, which were known as sometimes the Xiongnu, so the Mongols, the Huns from Central and Northern Asia. In addition, the fact that the empire was so big and the way it was governed, because there was so much autonomy for the provinces, because the provinces were pretty much entirely on their own, other than that one emir they had to report to, there was lots of independence among the provinces. Eventually, the provinces start to rebel. What should be noted is that even though this Abbasid Caliphate does eventually fracture into pieces and we end up with multiple Muslim kingdoms, they're all still Muslim. The faith had been successful. Even though the people eventually rebel under the rulership of the Abbasid families in the Abbasid Caliphate, the faith is ingrained into their culture by now. So Islam isn't going anywhere. It's just the rulers, so the religious authority is constant, but this the secular authority which sort of changes hands and moves around. So fleeing the conquest of the Abbasids, we see the Umayyad prince. The Umayyad prince, when the Abbasids take over in the 800s, 800s. So the Abbasids take over. The Umayyad family isn't eliminated; they're still alive. So the Umayyad remainder family, they actually flee to Spain, and they establish their own little kingdom in Spain in 755 at Cordoba, Cordoba, Spain. They establish a small independent kingdom now that they have been kicked out of Damascus, which again it moves to Baghdad. They're kicked out of the Arabian Peninsula, and they don't get assassinated. Some do get killed, but some do escape. They do this, so they establish a Cordoba little empire, kingdom in Spain. Same thing happens in the year 800 when the emir, who's actually over northern Africa, decides to become independent and decides he's no longer going to report to the emperor. He establishes his own kingdom in northern Africa. It's thousands of miles away. So he decides he's going to have his own kingdom. So we now have, by 800, we have a kingdom in Spain, we have a kingdom in northern Africa. So it's already starting to fall apart. Again, the Abbasids survive for centuries. The Abbasids survive until 1200s. But over time, the Abbasid Empire shrinks and shrinks to, by the end, it's an Abbasid kingdom. It's a much smaller kingdom as the empire fractures into pieces. Iranian forces take the city of Baghdad in 946, actually. Conquer the city of 946. They force the Caliph and the Abbasid population to submit to their leader, and Shia. So we get a Shia taking over in Baghdad. The Shia take over, and we start calling these the Shiites. They take over the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, another family clan, another family group, the Fatimids, they claim they're actually descended from Fatima, who is the daughter of Muhammad. Now, this is 230 years later. Whether that is an actual true claim and can be justified, I don't know. But they did claim, at least, that they were descended, in essence, they're descended from Muhammad. They claim that their leadership is actually a blood descendant over how many generations is that now? That's 10, 11 generations, 12 generations. That's pretty far, but nonetheless, they claim that they are 11, 12 generations descended from Muhammad, and they claim they are actually the true leaders of the caliphate. They are the true faith. It's taken them 200 years to regain control, and they do. They also gain control in northern Africa. They take over Egypt in 969. From this point on, the Abbasids were really pawns of the Shia. So the Abbasids, which were Sunni, if I believe, and were now being controlled by the Shia, who actually were sort of the authority pulling all the strings, even though the majority of the actual faithful were Sunni. Interesting. The Shia are in charge, even though the majority of the population are Sunni. I believe that's correct. I believe if I have my notes and I have that right, I think that's correct. It's interesting how that goes. All right, here we have the Fatimid Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, which is over here. The Fatimids take over northern Africa. Then eventually they conquer or control the Abbasid Caliphate, even though they're ideally two separate empires or kingdoms, really. The Fatimids control the Abbasids for a long time, and over time they just take more and more of the the Abbasid Empire, to where at the end, by the time the Abbasids finally collapse, they're just a small kingdom. Let's talk about Turkish people next. So this is what we think of as Egypt. This is the Egyptian area. Let's talk about Turkish peoples next. The ascendancy of the Turks. The Turkish people were one of the main sources of slave soldiers for the Abbasids. They were just really great soldiers. So it was common practice for the Abbasids to sweep in and conquer an entire community and take them as slaves, as I've already sort of explained. And those Turks eventually become Muslim soldiers and Muslim population. This was pretty common. Now, once they realized, many Turks realized that the Muslims were really prohibited from having Muslim slaves, this is one of the reasons the conversions become more and more common. Because as Islam, you should not, Islam allows slavery, but not of other Islamic peoples. So over time, the Muslim Turks convert more and more. This is actually a form of conversion. People would convert so as to not be enslaved. So we see more and more converting. The Turks began to convert to Islam. So by the 1020s and 1030s, we see a rising faction in Turkey, which is resisting the Abbasids. We call these the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks eventually invade into Iraq. They invade into Persia, which is really the core of the Abbasid Empire. Eventually, they overrun Baghdad, but they don't destroy the empire. They leave the caliph in charge, but they often run part of the government. So we have, for the last 250 years of the Abbasid Caliphate, they were never in charge. It was the Abbasid Caliphate and the same family who were actually the leaders, but behind the scenes, they were being really controlled by the Turks. They were being alternately controlled by the Turks, the Fatimids. Why didn't they just conquer? Why did they leave the Abbasids in charge for centuries, even though they really weren't running the show? Because the majority of the faith in the empire was one faith which matched up with the Abbasids. Therefore, much kept it much easier to keep the peace. Plus, you continue to have the same people in charge with the same faces, the same emperors, the same family line, which keeps a form of consistency and a form of stability. Even though much of the wealth and power is being bled off from the empire, going to other places, um, it keeps peace and stability in the empire. And peace and stability, of course, generates money, generates revenue, population growth, things like this. They replaced the military. The total military of the Abbasids are now run by the Seljuk Turks, almost like um, almost like a contractor or mercenaries. Your military is now the Seljuk Turks, and in most situations, if you aren't aware of this, you should have gotten this by now. Certainly, who controls the military is who really controls the empire. And so, therefore, the military is controlled by the Turks. So even though the Abbasids are still technically running the show, or apparently running the show, technically running the show are the Turks, or even sometimes the Fatimids. It's very interesting. This does give a big boost to military forces, and it does actually increase the military power and might of the actual military might and power of the Abbasids. Um, they have to constantly resist and fight against Christian crusaders from Europe because they're always fighting these Christian crusaders, fighting Muslims, fighting the Muslims, fighting Christians, the Byzantines, and of course, the whole Crusades are about to start. Now, once the Turks were in power, they were able to regain a lot of territory, regain a lot of power, a lot of authority, and they were able to fight back against the Christians. They eventually, the Christians take Jerusalem. The Muslims were able to fight back and take Jerusalem back. For instance, in the Battle of Manzikert, Byzantine forces were totally defeated by Muslim Turks, which were fighting in the name of the Abbasids. But it was really the Seljuk Turks doing all the work and doing the fighting. The Turks began to move into Byzantine lands. Eventually, the Turks take, in essence, they cut the Byzantine Empire in half. They take almost the entire eastern half of the Byzantine Empire, which today is Turkey. That is the Turkey. That's where it gets the name from. That was the eastern half of the Byzantine Empire. So these Turks move in, they become the military arm of the Abbasids. They sort of pull the strings behind the Abbasids, at least in the western part of the empire. The southern part of the Abbasid Empire is being really controlled, and strings are being pulled by the Fatimid Caliphate from Egypt. Really interesting how the Abbasids survive for centuries, even though they're really not in charge. They really don't have authority. The entire western part of their empire is run by other powers who it's still nominally considered the Abbasids, but that's sort of out of convenience. This gives the Seljuk Empire here. The Seljuks, Manzikert. This is what we would call today would be modern day Turkey. And we start having these new we start using another term which I haven't mentioned yet, sultanates. The This is a term referring to the kings and princes from Asia. So in the Middle East, the kings and princes are referred to as caliphs, but when they start coming down from Asia, they start renaming themselves sultans. It's the same thing. It's just the name they're using for king. So whether it's sultan or caliph, it's the same thing. These are the kings of these territories. So we see the Seljuk Empire here expanding dramatically, even though the caliphate still exists. We still have this Abbasid Caliphate here in the middle, which still exists. The Abbasids are still running the show, but the Seljuks have all the power. They have all the authority. I will look at the Mongol invasions. Then came the Mongol hordes. Oh, and they were horrible. I like to call these the first real terrorists. Um, they killed anything that stood in their way, men, women, children. Entire cities they would wipe out. They would, a city would challenge their authority. They would barricade the gates to the city, and they would firebomb it and burn down the entire city. Every man, woman, child, animal burned to death. They were brutal. Millions died to the hordes. Millions. No one has an accurate number, but all historians would say millions at the least died to the Mongol hordes. They were some bad mofo's. Um, Maybe the worst, most murderous people until modern times, perhaps. Pretty bad. One time, the Mongol horde was thought to have over 100,000 mounted armored warriors. Not like knight armored. They weren't like wearing that kind of armor, but they still wore armor of some type, like leather or different types of armors they would make out of leather or wood, for instance, which were actually quite effective. Quite effective against swords and arrows. So, how do they do this? Well, Chinggis Khan is the one that really starts it. He unites the various tribes living on the steppes of Mongolia, really northern and northeastern Asia. He creates a federation of multiple Mongol tribes, the Mongols, the Tatars, the Turks, and eventually he works together to take and conquer much of Persia and much of Central Asia, creating the largest single empire in the history of the world. Now, I said Islam grew to be massive and expansive and covered a massive area much bigger than Rome, but that was very short lived and really temporary, and it was really about the faith. It wasn't about a united kingdom. There was never a united empire of Persia, really, almost from the very beginning. Literally 5 years after we really started to, 5 years after it reached a large size, it broke apart immediately. So it was a massive territory of faith, but it was never this massive empire, this combined empire. The Umayyad, the Abbasid, neither one had that type of size. The Mongols at one time controlled pretty much all of Asia, with the exception of the southern part of India. They controlled everything from China all the way to Europe. It was an empire that might have spanned 1/5 of all land in the world, with the exception of Antarctica. We don't really put Antarctica in there because that's uninhabitable. But of the other 6 continents, it might have at one point covered almost 1/5 of all of the normal habitable land on the entire planet that the Mongols had. Nothing, no empire like it has ever existed before or since, as far as the actual square miles. It was massive. And it really starts here with Chinggis Khan. Sometimes you hear it referred to as Genghis Khan. There's lots of different ways to spell it. He eventually he lives in this time period, 1162, 1227. He rules from 05 to 1227. He united many different tribes. These are just a couple, lots of different Mongol tribes. His son, his grandson, Hulegu, he attacked and conquered the Abbasids in Baghdad. He's the one who actually brought down the Abbasid Caliphate finally. Even though the Abbasids had been puppets for 200 years of different empires, he's the one who actually officially ends it because he doesn't allow it to be a puppet anymore. He gets rid of all of, basically puts them all to the sword, kills them all, and takes over Baghdad and makes it his home. Um, Takes over Baghdad in 1258, moves on to Damascus, takes it over in 1260. and brings down the really last great Muslim empire. Don't get me wrong, Islam still is everywhere, but as far as an actual Muslim empire, he pretty much brings it down. The last of the ancient of the original Muslim empires, really. He doesn't conquer Egypt. He doesn't get to northern Africa. Ultimately, the only place that is left under Muslim control politically is a small kingdom in northern Africa and the kingdom in Spain. All the rest of the Muslim world is conquered by the Mongols, although they do conquer far more than that. Hulagu's descendants finally submit to Islam around 1295. So for a very long time, they were not Islamic, even though the core of their entire empire was Muslim lands, and the majority of the people were Muslim. Eventually, Ghazan, the descendant Ghazan Khan, that's why they call themselves the Khans, which was another word for king or lord, just another one of the many words used. They call themselves the Khans. Ghazan Khan finally submits to Islam in 1295, converts over, and from then on, the Mongols are nominally, the core of the Mongol Empire is nominally Muslim, even though most Mongols aren't. Most Mongols don't convert over to Islam. Most Mongols live in northern and central Asia, where Islam does not really expand dramatically. Well, hell, there's not many people up there, frankly. It's a very sporadic population. It's incredibly rough terrain, very limited resources, very little. You got to consider some of the biggest deserts in the world. Maybe not the biggest, which I think that's Sahara, right? But some of the biggest deserts in the world are in Central Asia. We often picture Central Asia as being cold and mountainous, which it has that, of course, but it also has the Gobi Desert, which is one of the driest places on Earth. So it's very limited resources. And where it isn't desert, it's mountains and rocks and sporadic trees and really very few places to grow farm goods. And so it doesn't necessarily really have a mass conversion of the Mongol peoples, but really that doesn't matter. All that matters is if the leadership converts. And eventually the leadership does convert over to this. Now, however, with the Mongols bringing in all this trade and all this knowledge and all these connections, you combine that with the intellectual capabilities and the scholarship and the culture of the Islamic world already, and it really rejuvenates it all. And we get a brand new Muslim empire known as the Ilkhanate. This becomes the Muslim empire, which is really over Persia and Central Asia, and it survives for about a century, known as the Ilkhanate. Let's look at Muslim society, life of the people living under the Muslim world. So we have social hierarchy. Uh, Supposedly, at the heart of Islam was total equality, total social equality. I say it that way because it wasn't practiced that way. If you really look at the Quran and you really look at the readings of the scripture, it really emphasizes equality and fairness to all peoples. Even among women, it indicates some certain status and equality among women. And the irony there, I suppose, is early on we saw that. Early on, we actually see a lot of equality under the Umayyads, a lot of status for women. Over time, that goes away. Over time, Islam becomes patriarchal, very much like all the other religious faiths at the time, Christianity, Judaism. It becomes, that's the way society was. In this time period, society was patriarchal, male dominated, misogynist. Women were treated as inferior. In most societies, women had the status, social, political status of children. Um, Initially, we see women having more status among the Muslims. That only really survives the Umayyad Caliphate. By the time we get to the Abbasids, women are again being treated as inferior status, and we see them relegated to a second class status again. Um, Even though, again, technically under the Quran, they're supposed to be pretty much social equality, it really isn't practiced that way. Now, there's nothing unusual about Islam with that. You see that with most faiths. The idea that they preach this idea of equality and fairness for all, but ultimately what it amounts to, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, The only real equality you're ever going to finally get as a woman in this time period is after you're dead, in heaven or whatever the spiritual realm is that is promised. Because here on earth in the material world, it doesn't really happen. Even if the faiths preach it or it's in the scripture, it often isn't actually manifested that way, no matter what faith it is. And Islam is no different. The social upper classes of this of the faith is usually Muslims by birth or the ruling elite. Um, to have real true status in Islam, to have any social status, you had to have been born Muslim. Even though in many parts of the Islamic world, the majority of the population were converts, not born into Islam, to have real status and authority in those societies required you to be born, which meant that oftentimes outsiders had more status because the outsiders are the conquerors. They come in, they're the ones that are born into the faith, and while other people who they conquer are converted. So even though they're outsiders, they actually have more status and authority simply because they were born Islamic. Um, Now, converts brought in everything, though. You got to consider the core of the Islamic faith was only 10% of the population, approximately. Everyone else were pretty much converts in most of these regions. So the converts brought in all the merchants. They brought in all the commercial abilities. They were the laboring class. They were the majority of the population in many areas. Until Islam had been situated for a few generations, you find the majority of the people are not born into it. But that still means the majority of the population still are there, and they have to contribute economically and politically and militarily to the society. Um, Now, another one of the results of this issue, because it is so hard to be part of the ruling class, which is primarily, especially under the the Umayyads, under the Abbasids, the ruling class is, I believe, Sunni. And so, what you actually find is one of the things that draws people to the Shia faith is the fact that they are not being given equal social opportunity among the ruling elite, which is the empire itself. So this is actually one of the things that pushes people to choose the Shia faith. Some choose to do it because the Sunni faith simply is not treating them, they believe, with the proper respect or the proper equality as proclaimed by the Quran. Those who lived in Muslim lands were not converted are often referred to as Jimmies. This is pronounced a Jimmy. So Jimmies would be Christians or Jews, for instance, or other peoples who simply didn't convert. They were allowed to stay there. They were often allowed to practice their religion. However, they had to pay a tax. They had to pay the head tax, known as the jizra. We find in most cases, Muslims are far more accepting of Christians than the other way around. We find that in most situations, Muslims, as long as the Christians submit to Muslim authority, they're often still allowed to have their churches, their faith, they're continued to practice. Some of them are even still allowed to have continued connections with, say, Byzantium or Rome, trade connections or political connections. As long as they accept the rulership, which is a Muslim authority and Muslim elite, they don't have to convert. Matter of fact, Muslims didn't want them to in many cases. Because if they maintain those Christian or Jewish connections with their old trade networks going into other empires, it often facilitates greater trade, greater economic stimulus, and further, they pay the tax. And the jizra was a significant source of revenue for the Muslim empire. Because at one point, there was thought to be millions of non-Muslims, millions and millions of non-Muslims living in a Muslim empire. Matter of fact, in many regions, the majority population was not Muslim even though it was a Muslim kingdom or Muslim empire. So it was a massive source of revenue. In so many cases, it allowed Muslims to, they simply left them alone. So we do find in most cases, it does seem in this time period that Muslims were more accepting of Christians than Christians were of Muslims. It does seem in this time period certainly that way. Even maybe it was just for financial reasons or simply simplicity. Instead of trying to do a mass conversion of populations, really, as I mentioned before, all you got to do is convert the bosses. If the bosses are converted, then they're going to do what you need. They're going to have the trade and political connections you need. And if the rest of the regular workers, everyday people don't convert, who cares? They're still going to go to their jobs every day. They're still going to go to the market every day. They're still going to go out to the farms every day. no matter what religion they are. So if they convert or don't convert, does it really matter? As long as the power is in the hands of the Muslim elite. Slavery was a significant part of the empire, as all of them were. All empires in this time period had slaves. The Byzantines had slaves. Slavery was, you still had slaves in Europe, although it wasn't as common. But the closer and closer you got out of Central Europe, the more slaves you would find. Byzantine Empire had all kinds of slaves. Christian Empire, of course, Rome had slavery was common. At this point in time, we find slavery in India. We find slavery in India, China. We find slavery in Africa. So it's nothing unusual. So it was pretty common. However, the Quran did specifically talk about slaves, as does the Bible. In the Quran, slaves have to be treated fairly. Slaves have to be treated as an extended member of your family. They have to be obedient at all times, but as long as the slaves are obedient, they're to be treated fairly, justly, and they are to be given food like the rest of your family, and in many ways, an extended member of your family. And even you should attempt to free slaves whenever economically possible. Slaves should be given freedom if able to do that. So slavery was not a permanent situation, as it does become eventually under the Christians. Eventually, under European Christians, slavery becomes a permanent condition, as evidenced by what happens in America. You know, who brought all the slaves to America, and of course, America Christians. So, I mean, the Christian world continues to facilitate and grow slavery after most parts of the world stop. But at the end of the day, what was it about? It was about money. So in this time period, slavery is still pretty common. During most of their military campaigns, the Muslims would capture slaves. Often soldiers would have slaves. Uh, Common to take female slaves, child slaves. There were even entire slave armies, usually Turkish armies, which I already mentioned before. Unless you converted. If you were able to convert and allowed to convert, and sometimes slaves were not allowed to convert, they were forbidden to convert to practice Islam. But if you were able to convert, then they had to let you go as well. But again, manumission, which was letting go of a slave, manumission was common in Islam. Slaves were often manumitted. So women slaves were often kept as prostitutes, as part of concubines, as sexual slaves. Women, of course, were kept as servants, domestic slaves. Domestic slavery was common. But we also did another interesting thing because they would conquer these territories with cities that are already established. When you go into a city, you have musicians, you have doctors, you have lawyers, you have artists that are already there. Maybe they're Christian. And so when the Muslims would come in and conquer it, they would actually take those people and make them slaves. So you'd have doctor slaves, lawyer slaves, artist slaves, musician slaves. They were allowed to continue practicing their work. So you would have a doctor that continued to be a doctor, a lawyer, a dancer, a musician, an artist that continued to do their job, although they were technically a slave. So this idea of slavery we have on the Muslims wasn't the kind of slavery we often imagine of people walking around in chains all the time, slave labor. That did exist. But the majority of slaves in the Muslim Empire actually lived as normal citizens, even though they were technically owned by someone else. But most of them operated normal lives. Most of them had families, and some of them even owned property or businesses, even though they were actually slaves. Interesting, yeah. Interesting way of life. Interesting how it worked. Rome had some of this. Rome was known to have slaves that actually owned slaves. That were, and Islam has some of that too. Women were often secluded in harems. Harem doesn't necessarily mean prostitute, but they were often secluded. Men would often have multiple wives, and they kept the women away and kept them secluded to protect their virtue because inheritance was very important. The Muslim Empire had a lot of money. Muslim peoples and the empires and kingdoms were quite wealthy, so they always had to protect you always wanted to protect your inheritance. You wanted to make sure when your wealth was passed down that that boy was your boy, that it wasn't some other man's child. So they would keep the women locked up, they would keep them protected, and they usually had eunuchs guarding the women. Eunuchs are castrated men. And the reason they had them castrated, of course, so there's no way they could impregnate the women. Some men would volunteer to be eunuchs. Why, you say? Why would you volunteer to have your stuff cut off down there? For status. If you were not able to impregnate a woman, you actually could have elevated social status in the Islamic community. It doesn't mean you were Islamic, but you could have elevated social status as a local person because you were safe. They didn't have to worry about you. The impression among Muslims were you were no longer a full man. So, number one, you couldn't have children and you couldn't impregnate women, so you were no threat to the women. But further, this type of emasculation meant that you were not a threat politically or militarily. They didn't think you were going to try and take over the empire or assassinate them. They were wrong on that matter. Eunuchs were often known to be involved in assassination plots because they were so well trusted. They were such well trusted because they were thought to be safe since they were only a half a man, as how they were portrayed. Um, and yet, we do know eunuchs often participated in assassination plots because they did have access that some others did not have access to. So it's interesting. So they filled political roles. I mean, they could be laborers too. I mean, stuff like this. But further, children of a slave woman was considered free. So, and because if you were born to, put it this way, if you were born to a Muslim, you were considered Muslim. So therefore, if it was a slave woman and a Muslim man had a child and she was a prostitute, a concubine, part of his harem, for instance, then the child was free because one of the parents was Muslim. So the Islamic faith was actually believed to sort of be passed down through the blood as well. So if you had a child and you were a Muslim, then your child is free even if one of the parents was a slave. Again, the harem could include wives and concubines. So a Muslim man might have multiple wives, and then in addition to that, he might have multiple concubines, which were it was a status thing, really. I don't think for a moment that these men went out and had sex like showed in this picture. Did this guy go out and have sex with 7 different women every night or something? No, it wasn't about that. It was really the idea of status because the more women you could support meant you were wealthier. It was simply a status symbol. It was like, what do rich people today do? They wear fancy clothes, they wear $200,000 watches, they drive Lamborghinis, they own 3 mansions. Your big celebrities and your sports stars. They love showing their wealth. You know, they go to lunch. What I hear was that 2 or 3 years ago, Beyonce and Jay-Z went to some little cafe in Los Angeles and had lunch, and they gave like a $5,000 tip and spent $2,000 on lunch because they were like buying $100, $500 bottles of champagne. Ridiculously stupid. And yet, it's simply displaying wealth. To go out and have a 2-hour meal and spend 7 grand. I mean, it's ridiculously insane, but it is what rich people do. They waste their money because they want to display their wealth. They want to display their status. Same thing here. I've got 10 wives. That shows I've got status, I've got wealth, I've got power, I've got a bigger house, I've got more land. It's all saying, mine's bigger than yours. It's all, it's the same thing. It's always been this way through history. Someone always has to be the big dog and pretend they're bigger than everyone else. Women in classical Islamic society, the hadith, which are the records of Muhammad's sayings and actions, they vary in how he portrayed his wives and how he acted towards his wives. Some hadiths report that women were seen as frail and jealous. But most actually describe wives as models of righteousness and power and authority in Islam. So the majority of the hadith seems to indicate that Muslim wives were to be righteous and have authority in the home, having high political authority, even leaders. Even Muhammad's daughter Fatima was a leader and had authority after his death and even during his life. So yeah, women were portrayed with status early on. Early on, women seem to have more status and authority. The Quran, though, is not quite as clear. The Quran is not quite as clear. Talks about women, talks about social status and equality, but it's vague. Put it this way. Interpreted in the ways of our American Declaration and Constitution, with phrases like all men are created equal, while at the same time we were keeping slaves. Think about it that way. The idea that the Quran talks about all social equality for all, but it doesn't specifically talk about women, just like our Constitution and our Declaration does specifically talk about slaves. Slaves are left out of both completely. They simply gloss over this idea. So all men are created equal. If you lived in the time period in the 1700s, then you actually understood that meant all men, meaning all white men. And even truthfully, it really meant white men that owned property. Even though it seems very obvious in the Declaration and in the writings, in actual practice, it didn't apply to most men, actually. Sort of same thing in the Quran. Quran gives the implication of social equality for all, but then it's very vague on how it's to be instituted and very vague on the actual rules per se of how it's to be done. It really talks about moral equivalent, moral equality, spiritual equality. Um, Ultimately, women are to maintain high morals and to be treated with respect, but it leaves the interpretations very wide open. Early on, interpretations are much more liberal for women. Later on, the interpretations are far more conservative and strict. But the Quran is just sort of vague on it. It really is. In early Muslim societies, you see women given greater liberties, greater rights. They even owned property, they owned businesses, they could control caravan lines. In the Umayyad period, for instance, women maintained roles in religious authority. Women could actually have authority in the Muslim religious faith, which doesn't really exist anymore. Economic, political environments, this didn't last though. By the end of the Umayyads, which was literally just really the first 100 years or so of the faith, women are already being relegated to second class status. They're being moved out of any religious authority. Um, and by the 800s, it is very clear in Muslim society, Arabian society, that men are dominant, women are subservient, and girls are now. By the 800s and 900s, women are basically treated as property. It's standard for girls to be actually married as young as age 12. That doesn't necessarily mean it was consummated at 12, but they wanted to ensure the girl was a pure virgin, so they'd marry like a 12-year-old girl to a 40-year-old man. Again, it doesn't mean that they had sex at that age, although sex did start relatively young. It would have been in their teen years. But they wanted to make sure the girl was a virgin. So they had to marry her off and have her secluded and basically locked up in the harem before she actually reached sexual maturity, where she could have a child. Um, so they were locked up and put away behind closed doors while they were still young virgins, young little girls, to protect them. But it really was about protecting the man's power. It really was about protecting the man. It really wasn't about protecting the girls. Men were typically permitted to have up to four wives. Sex was actually seen as pleasurable. So these harems were, it was okay to have to sex with multiple women, have multiple wives. And of course, procreation was incredibly important. Another one of the reasons why slave women having children with Muslim men were considered Muslim children, they had no problem with that. There was no issue with that because once that happens and the child is born of the Muslim man, it has been blessed by Allah. So it's no longer a slave. It's no longer a impure child. Even though the wife or the concubine might have been impure, once the child is of the genetic or the blood of the man, in essence, the child's been purified because the man's blood has purified the child, or the man's DNA or whatever is his blood, I guess might have been the way they put it at the time. So it's now a pure child, now that it has been born of a Muslim man. Family life was very important. It was just unusual and a little bit different the way they did it. It was different than in most places in the world in this time period. The veil is interesting. The veil, which the full covering, which as you see here in the imagery, um, initially this was not Islamic. This was actually borrowed from Byzantium. Byzantines did this in the 500s, 600s. It was actually common for them to do this to their women, to have women entirely covered up to protect their modesty and their purity. This was actually a Byzantine tradition. The Muslims probably learned it from them. In general, this might have just been something that came from the Middle East. This might have been a tradition that existed even before the Byzantines, having women covered, protected. We think the Muslims might have done it in large part due to differentiate them from common women. Because common women didn't wear coverings. Common women have jobs. They worked. They had careers. They had to go out and do things. They couldn't go around covered like this all the time because they had to actually work for a living. This was to establish middle and upper class Muslim women set them apart, make them special. Yeah. The origin of this is a little unclear. We see it in early Persia. We also see it in Byzantium. The point is, we see this all before Islam even exists. So this is not something created by Muslims. This is something they adopted from other earlier traditions, and they simply adopted it and became part of their society. Um, Eventually, they're to be completely covered to protect their nature, protect their purity. Yeah, it's interesting how this starts and how they develop and they adapt it. And the last thing I'll mention on this section is the practice of purdah, or the harem system. Where does this harem system come from of having all these women, having these concubines and wives? It really comes from the Arabian contacts with the Persians. The harem existed long before Islam. The idea of harem and having a whole group of wives and concubines that existed before them. And it is exactly as I already described this. I really already described this one. It's the idea of status. Having more and more women indicated higher status and wealth. In ancient history, this would have been the same thing, only it would have been cows. In much early human society, the number of animals you had, the more cows you had, the more horses you had, the more, I don't know, sheep you had. In essence, the more things of value you had, the more powerful you were. So the more horses, the more cows, the more sheep you had indicated your status because you had those as wealth or you could maintain those and provide for them. Wives are the same thing. Really, by the 1200s, women are seen as simply as property and for a purpose of procreation. They have no status, no legal power, no social power. They're not even allowed to read the Quran. They're not even allowed to open it up. It is men only that can even touch a Quran. And therefore, anything women learn of religious authority, anything women learn of Scripture, has to come out of their husbands' mouths or their fathers' mouths or their religious leaders. Um, this gives you an image here of separating men and women. This is a actual wall. This blue thing here is an actual barricade. Why? Good discussion question. Why is it that they're doing this? Would be a mosque in prayer, and yet the men and women are separated. The men are here. Look at the way the men are dressed, and look at the way the women are dressed. We have the children. You have children with the women. So they're separated here. How does this demonstrate the proper roles? Here is the political leader, by the way, pardon me, the religious leader, the imam, maybe, up here at the top. Um, so, how does that work? How does this work? Why do the men get to sit with the imam, but the women don't? Why is there got to be a wall between the men and women? Families aren't sitting together. The husbands are over here. The wives and kids are over here. What about the position? In an image, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You must consider everything. What about the image that the men are on top and also shown much bigger? If you actually look at the relative size, the men are shown bigger than the women. In some cases, 50% bigger. The men are at the top, women are at the bottom. The majority of the image is the men. The women get a little sliver at the bottom, even though there are more women. If you actually count them, there's more women and children at the bottom than the men. But they only get about 1/4 of the entire picture. So think about what this says about women's status, what this says about women in response to religion, and think further about what it says about male status in religion and how the male's authority and religion authority. Also look at the posture of the women versus the posture of the men. Look about how the women are postured and look how they're covered and what are the women's focus on? It seems pretty obvious what the women are focused on. What are the men focused on? Very significant how the women are positioned. I mean, there's so many aspects of this. Good discussion question to really talk about all of the meanings of this and how all the different positioning, the imagery, the colors. Look at how the colors of the women, look at the colors of the men. Look at what that says as well. Men are all different. Women are uniform in color. Clothing we're talking about. So there's so many aspects to this. about what this says about relationships between men and women in the society. It's very glaring. It's very damning, really, in the way that women are treated in the society and the expectations of women. And then lastly, think about why. I've talked about really what it means. I mean, look at all the different spatial relationships, the color relationships, the relationships to the religious leader, the issues with the men and the attire and all that, the positioning. But also think about where this, what's the rationale for it? I really already sort of told you that on the previous slide. What's the rationale for this? I pretty much explained it to you before. So, give me a little bit of that too on the discussion. Give me a little bit about the rationale for why this occurs like this. Um, it's really interesting. Veiling and seclusion of women really becomes an issue in the Abbasid Caliphate, which really becomes the core of the Muslim world. This really becomes standard issue. Another thing I will say finally, think about status. The higher status you were, the best way to say it is the more clothes you wore, the more coverage you were. The lower status you were, the less coverage you could be. Also think about whether you're free or slave. The more free you were, more covering. The less free you were, the more slave you were, the less covering. All right, we're to the last section in the chapter, the last thing we're going to talk about. So this last part is really going to cover trade and culture, trade, commerce, and culture. So non-Muslim trade from 1000 to 1500. The Quran does not prohibit trade in any way. Trade was a major part of their income. So lots of trade with Christians, lots of trade with the West, lots of trade with Chinese, lots of trade with India. Very profitable. The Muslim world was the center of the trade routes between East and West. Much of their revenue came from trade and the merchant caravan lines. Probably more trade went through the Muslim world than any other place in the world at the time. Again, it was literally in the middle. It was in the middle of Afro-Eurasia. So any kind of cross-continental, cross-cultural trade would have gone possibly, very likely, through the hands of a Muslim person as a middleman, very possibly. From 1000 to 1500, commerce and wealth traded through the Muslim lands, especially waterways. We're always talking about caravans, but you must understand a lot of trade went over the water too. The the We have the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Black Sea, other places like this. Lots of trade going over land and sea. Lots of economic innovations which allow this to happen more easily. We see banking becoming a brand new thing where you don't have to transport money over long periods. You simply have bank bills, letters of credit. So where you can, in essence, take a letter from one part of the empire to the other part of the empire and give that letter to someone, and it's almost like a check. They'll give you money for it because there's long established trade networks. So you could have banking, you could have loans, supply orders, bills of exchange, or the SOC. The SOC. This is where we get the modern check. This is the forerunner of the original of the check, of what we call the check today. It was an actual document that you would take as exchange for goods, and it was almost like an IOU, but it was backed up because there was such a well-established banking and trade system that I would accept a check from you with some person's name on it saying so and so in this trade agency will back this piece of paper up for however much money, and I'd be willing to take that instead of the actual money. So lots of innovations and economics here, which really become heavily influential in our modern economic system. It certainly does. Lots of technological improvements as well. Large ships in the world, the largest ships in the world. So we have ships being sailed by Muslim merchants that can carry 400 tons of goods. Europeans don't build ships that big. Centuries after this, their ships don't carry that much tonnage. So, largest ships ever built in the world, with the exception of the Chinese treasure fleet. But that was a really unusual thing, which I'm not going to get into. But they built ships that were They were unheard of. They were the bigger. They were ships they built at the time, the Chinese treasure ships that were literally the size of modern day battleships, bigger than anything had ever been built until the last 100 years. But they only survived for a few decades, and they tear them all down and build cities out of them. Very interesting. Nonetheless, other than that one little anomaly, these are by far the biggest ships in the world. Exchange of we have the big ships, and of course, being able to have long distance trade. Exchange of products really helps improve diets. We have a plant exchange, plants, sugar, cotton, sugar cane, rice, citrus fruits from Southeast Asia, from India. It really expands the diet. Why does that matter? An expanded diet means people are healthier. The greater variety of foods you consume, healthy foods, not garbage like junk food today, but the greater variety of different types of foods you get more vitamins, more minerals, you're healthier. So this actually improves the worldwide diet, having a greater exchange of goods between East and West, and all of it really passing through Muslim hands in the Muslim world. So yeah, a greater exchange of technology, and this isn't even really talking about religion and that kind of stuff, which is also significant. That really is what we'll talk about next is the cultural exchange. This cultural exchange, which is the second part of this. It's all part of the end of the chapter, but it's sort of it's the first half, second half. Trade and commerce. We see the trade routes here going across northern Africa. And if you look at this, how much of this is the Islamic world? Most of it. The core of all of it is Islamic. You've got northern Africa here, the Sahara trade routes, which expands even further. And look at all this. By 1500, all of this is Islamic. East Africa, all of northern Africa, of course, the entire Middle East, all the way to India. All of this is Islamic. Islam spread by 1500. Why 1500? Because that's really the date we start to use when the Europeans start to spread out around the world. The era of European colonization begins around 1500. So at the time the European Christians start to really spread out across the world, we have most of the old world where most people live, with the exception of China, where most people in the world live, is now under either under the authority or influenced by Islam. Something like 70% of the world's population is under the authority of or influenced by Islam, with the exception of China. Uh, really interesting. Really interesting. The authority and power of the Islamic faith. Cultural centers of Baghdad and Cordoba. Two cultural intellectual centers of Islam are Baghdad and Cordoba, Spain, by the 10th century. Um, Shops and people of every kind can be found on these streets. They came from every corner of the world, from Asia to Europe to Africa. The courts of the caliphs, the caliphs, the kings, the courts were filled with dancers. They were filled with musicians and dancers and scholars and storytellers. Arabian folklore is really important and significant. Some of the most recognized folklore of this time period is, most of us have heard of these things: Arabian Nights or The Thousand and One Nights. Incredibly important literary work from this time period. You've all heard of Aladdin and Sinbad and Ali Baba. All that comes out of this. Multiple I think there are 7 different Disney movies or stories that have come directly out of 1001 Nights. Anyway, so this is heavily influential upon our modern lifetime. Very few people have not seen a story of Sinbad or Ali Baba or Aladdin. Almost everyone has seen or heard of these things. And this is culture that comes out of Baghdad in this time period, Muslim writings. So very influential culturally, intellectually on the time period. Cordoba, southern Spain, was culturally advanced, probably the most advanced city in Europe. Centuries earlier, that would have been Rome, but of course Rome fell in hard times after the fall of the empire. So probably the most advanced city at the time. The most advanced people at the time were Muslims, hands down, intellectually, culturally, scientifically. They had schools, universities. Baghdad had schools and universities across the whole place. It was probably they were probably the most educated, literate people in the world. Probably would be wrong. I'm sure they were. Uh, Universities, 500 years before Europe starts building universities. Population of probably also a million, probably close to a million people in Cordoba, Spain. Paved streets, thousands of mosques, public baths. They had a sewer system when most people in Europe were still pissing in the gutters. Um, Europe was still in the Dark Ages, really, in many ways, and the Muslims are building grand works of architecture and statues and universities and churches and libraries and schools of learning and math and science. This is really significant because when Europe does finally emerge out of the Dark Ages and does actually finally start to advance intellectually and culturally, much of what they learn and use to become dominant in the world, they borrow from the Muslims. They actually pay scholars to come from Baghdad and Cordoba to teach in the schools in Paris and London and Italy and Rome. They bring these people from foreign countries that are far more literate, far more educated, and they bring them to teach the scholars in Europe, borrowing their knowledge, borrowing their ideas. Education and intellectual life. The core of education became the study of Quran. That was the core of education, as evidenced by this image you see here. The study of the Quran. The Quran had thought to be perfect Arabic script. So if you were able to learn how to write perfectly, you would copy the Quran. You would copy parts of the Quran in Arabic, of course. Also thought to have perfect spelling and grammar. It was a perfect book in every way. The words were perfect because it's words of God. So therefore, everything in the Quran is perfect. The writing is perfect. The script is perfect. The handwriting is perfect. The way the words are spelled or pronounced is it's all all perfect. This later period of Islam, up to 1400, was certainly a golden age of Islamic authority and technology and education. Religious schools were often referred to as madrasas. This where they would teach specific lessons on Muslim law, the faith. We see madrasas in all cities, all Muslim cities, all larger cities would have a madrasa school. And it was teach people, teach men, specifically men, about the Quran. And the number one way you learned was through listening to Muslim scholars and memorizing the Quran. You were expected to have the Quran memorized by as young as age 8. So by 8 years old, you were expected to have the entire book memorized if you were an elite and you were able to have spent most of your childhood in the madrasas. There was also higher education, what we would think more as like universities and colleges, often focused on a relationship between teachers and students. Very often the teacher, put it this way, very often the student would choose the teacher. The student would go around and look for a teacher that had high status or a good reputation. And very much your advancement in the upper echelon of Muslim society was ensuring you had the right teacher, the right mentor, because you could then use that almost as a resume. Oh, I was mentored by so and so, and therefore I deserve this job or this position because I have been taught by the best, for instance, something like that. So the teacher was often more important than the school, and the students were responsible for choosing the proper teacher. We actually still use elements of this in our modern society. If any of you ever end up going to grad school, when you go to grad school, you actually choose the professor you work with. You actually go around and look to different grad schools and you try to find the right university professor that you want to actually become your mentor. So today we still do a version of this, although not usually for bachelor's degree, but you do it for masters and PhDs. You actually will find and actually search out a teacher and ask them to mentor you. So we still do this today, and this is where we learned it from. We learned it from the way they taught people at the madrasa schools and the way they taught people at the Muslim and universities. It's interesting. The kinds of things we don't realize where the ideas actually came from and where we learned this from. Um, Higher education was primarily for men. Pretty much the only way a woman got taught is if the father decided to have a private tutor. But as far as the schools go, they were for boys only. Higher education was typically for boys only. Occasionally, girls did get education, but it was almost exclusively if the father chose to hire private tutors, because the girls were not welcome at the schools, generally speaking. So yeah, and if you got a higher education, what do you want to be good? You want to become a teacher yourself, or a lawyer, a minister, something like that, to get an education. Study of language was also important. Study of language, of course, you had to study Arabic first and foremost, but most Muslim scholars were knew multiple languages. It was very common for them to still study Greek because Greek was still a prominent language in the Eastern Roman Empire, which much of Asia had been part of the Eastern Roman Empire. So Greek is still a common language that would be taught. Arabic, of course, is the official language, but you can find other languages taught too. You would find Muslim scholars that could read Latin and Greek. And a big part of that was their interactions. Where did a lot of their trade go? A lot of their trade went westward into Byzantium and into Europe, where pretty much everyone there was Christian when they often understood Greek and Latin. So knowledge of language was really important for trade, which was, of course, a major aspect of the Muslim world, was trade and merchant contacts. So being able to speak languages of people you're trading with, of course, facilitates trade. But officially, the language of the law, the language of the government, and the language of the faith, of course, was Arabic. Um, let's see. Oh, I should also note that that's another really important thing. Specifically, where most people were not required to convert to Islam, anyone who dealt in business deals was required to use Arabic. So even if you weren't forced to be Islamic, you were forced to use Arabic because that was the language of all official business, whether it be government, religious, trade, everything official was Arabic. So you might not be Islamic, but you still had to speak and know that language if you were going to in any way participate in the Muslim world. Um, we will move this over here now. See what else you want to look at. Medicine was important. The most advanced doctors in the world were Muslim doctors. They wrote books on medicines, on diseases. They wrote books on drugs, useful drugs to be used. They invented the pharmacy, the actual an actual centralized location where you could go and actually purchase or find drugs that could be used for medicinal purposes. The pharmacy, they invented it. Um, they also did some of the earliest surgeries. They were the first people to remove like bladder stones, to actually kidney stones, stuff like that. They did heart surgeries. They did brain surgeries. I'm not saying they were always successful, considering the limited technology they had at the time, but they had no problem doing surgeries on humans to try and keep them alive. Internal surgery, internal medicine was common practice in all of the large cities and communities in the Muslim world. Yeah, while in Europe, pretty much every doctor was simply sticking leeches on you and hoping the leeches would suck out all the sickness. That was the most common medical practice of doctors in Europe, was to cover you in leeches, and the leeches would suck out all the bad diseased blood. That was medicine in Europe, while the Muslims are doing internal surgery and saving people's lives for real and using actual medicine and drugs. Yeah. Where do Europeans get all this stuff? Europeans, so much technology Europeans learn, which eventually allow them to overtake the entire rest of the world. They simply learn from the Muslims along the trade routes or through an exchange of scholars and intellectuals, which is actually really common after the Crusades. For the Crusades, which went from around the year 1000 to 1200, Muslims and Christians spent 200 years pretty much slaughtering each other. But after the Crusades ended in 1200, we see a big facilitation of trade and exchange of culture, which truthfully benefits Europeans. The benefit to the Muslims is simply revenue and money. But the benefit to Europeans is the huge exchange of ideas. The exchange of ideas and culture and knowledge and science and technology and medicine, it's almost one way, directly into Europe. The Muslims, all they knew, went along the trade routes into Europe, which allows Europe in the course of a 200-year period to become dominant and actually overtake the Muslims. But they learned most of it. most modern science and learning in the 13, 14, 15, 1600s, almost all of it came from Islamic world. Muslim philosophers and writings as well, lots of them inspired by the Greeks, the Romans, the relationship between God, the universe, and man. Another thing which is really important, a lot of the classical learning that we see in Byzantium and in Christian Europe, much of it was lost after the fall of the Roman Empire. When Europe went through about 300 years of dark ages, from the 400s to the 700s, much of that learning was simply gone. It was destroyed, disappeared. However, it wasn't. Where did it go? It actually went into the hands of many Muslim peoples in the Middle East. And we will find books and literature and scholarship in libraries and universities in Baghdad or Cordoba that don't even exist in Rome or Greece anymore, even though they are Roman and Greek works. So many of the ancient knowledge, classical knowledge, we today refer to as the classics, which is based of much learning in modern day. Much of that was lost through the Roman and Greek world and then recovered by the Muslims and brought and saved by them. Had they not used it, and of course it helped them advance too. So had they not used that and used that knowledge, which is translated from Latin and Greek into Arabic, and then centuries later, European scholars take that knowledge and translate it from Arabic into modern European languages like French and German and English. Use it to help advance Europe. And the last thing I'll mention is women. Women typically did not have any legal, social, or religious authority. Pretty simple. They had almost no authority whatsoever. The Quran leaves the interpretation of women entirely. The Quran does say women are lower status than men, but they would still should have equal social status in most situations, except religious. Specifically religious, men have authority. But other than that, that right there, it's very ambiguous how women should be treated. Ultimately, women have pretty much no status, no education, and are given almost no authority in Muslim society uh, at all, even though they did have some of that initially. It goes away completely. And specifically, where it comes to education, you find the vast majority of women are illiterate. Even if the men in their family are literate, women simply aren't given that acceptance or that status, unless the father or husband, in very unique cases, decides to allow the daughter or wife to be educated. And that's it. That's the end of the chapter, and we will see you next time.